course, it's time for another episode of Jason's Game Room, the only podcast on YouTube that covers all aspects of gaming, from board games to CCGs to dice games and, of course, video games. It's all here on this podcast. So don't forget to keep checking back for new episodes. You never know what you might hear or learn on this show. Now, on today's episode, I want to get back into the realm of customizable card games, or CCGs as they're known as. More specifically, I want to talk to you about the Star Trek CCG and strategies and anything else that entails. As I've alluded to on my minor series entitled The Basics, as of late I've been going into certain card sets and strategies and things like that. And I wanted to do a full episode on the podcast talking about it as well, because there are a lot of players still playing the Star Trek CCG 1E and a couple that are tuning into the show. And I've also made a new friend recently who plays the Star Trek CCG, and maybe he'll get some insight from this. And one of the first things I want to talk about in terms of strategy is your strategy doesn't begin when you sit down at the table to play your opponent, whether it be house rules or in a tournament. Your strategy begins when you start constructing your deck. And of course, I've said this before, and I've also mentioned it on the basics, and I'll say it again, is the affiliation you start with is everything. Because once you pick your affiliation, then you get your personnel and your ships to ferry them around the space line. But more importantly, it sets up your missions, dilemmas to go under the missions, as well as the other cards in your deck that you're going to play with. Now, to give you a quick example of certain ways things can go, I'll give you an example of a few of the decks that I have constructed. The first being is my Federation deck, which is my main playable deck. I use it in house games, and I have used it in tournaments. And my Federation deck focuses on personnel with high attributes as well as power cards that can do very, very big things in a short amount of time. So, for example, cards that I would have as I consider them as heavy hitters in my Federation deck would be events like QNet and Rescue. And I'm not going to get into what the cards are and what they do, because you should know this by now, and it's very time consuming. But needless to say, those two events are important on their own. I have interrupts like Temporal Rift, Countermanda, Q2. I do have the 2-card combo, which is Supernova and Toxutot. One is an event, one is an artifact. It is banned in tournament play still to this day, because, long story short, a long time ago somebody whined and cried because they got beaten by it and it got taken out. But it gives you a taste of what I put into my decks. And the Federation deck that I've been speaking of, it also has a lot of enhancements that deal with the personnel and the ships, because if I'm going to the trouble of assembling a deck that has high attribute personnel on ships, I want to be able to safely send these ships up and down the space line without getting destroyed by something unknown, or like that my opponent could put out, like Rogue Borg or Borg Cube from the original set. And as well, if he has some powerful ships, if he's playing as Romulan, and their ships usually have excellent weapons and shields, I want to be prepared for that as best I can. You're never going to be 100% prepared for what your opponent's doing, but needless to say, my Federation deck prepares for some of that. And I do swap out a good handful of cards now and again, especially after every game I play with this deck, because it keeps it fresh. One of the worst things you can do in terms of a strategy is keep the deck the same from game to game. Years ago, I used to play against a guy in high school. Josh, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but I have to use you as an example this one time, where we played a few games in a row that spanned a couple days, and you kept your one deck the same. And okay, the first time you beat me, and to my surprise, the second game I saw the same thing started coming up. I beat you the second game by, I believe it was 25 points from one mission that I eked out. And the third game, I was more surprised you had that same deck in the same configuration, and I beat you outright. And I can't remember if I was using my Klingon deck or I had another deck that I swapped out. But regardless, that's an example to use. Do not keep the deck the same. You can keep the personnel to a certain extent, but you want to start swapping out cards between games, especially if you're going into a tournament. Another facet of strategy that comes up a lot, and the dynamics of which changed heavily when the Blaze of Glory expansion came out, and you can see where I'm going, and I'm talking about the battle aspect, because the battle aspect was quite simple. It was based on mathematics and the numbers that dealt with, and I'm talking ship battles here, that talk with the attacks and defense of the ships on the space line. So you'd compare the shields and the weapons and go from there and do your calculations, turn the card halfway for damage, and that's how you had your battles. And there were some cards, like the enhancement cards, that made it a bit different. So your opponent or even yourself would have higher shields or higher weapons, and you'd be trading math back and forth. But getting off topic a little bit, when Blaze of Glory came out and added the tactic cards, you could now target certain aspects of your opponent's ships. And you'd be targeting not just the whole ship itself, but like shields, weapons, and there'd be evasive maneuvers, there'd be ways to escape it. You'd have tractor beam. If you were playing as Borg, you'd have cutting beam. So my experience, and if anyone's forgotten, I've been playing the Star Trek card game since 1994, which was when it came out. My experience with the battle schematic is that the tactic cards, yes, they enhanced the battles and made it a little bit more exciting to play, but at the end of the day, it still comes down to the enhancements based on that ship. If it's shields or weapons or range or whatnot, there's still a bit of math to do. And regardless if your opponent is playing a deck that's heavy on tactic cards or doesn't have any, you still want to have a certain amount of enhancements in your deck, like nutational shields or captain's log, metaphasic shields, anything that can give your ship the advantage in battle, because that can make or break you if the game comes down to a battle at a spaceline location that you're both vying for. It's not as cut and dry as, oh, I'm going to go attempt this mission and everything's going to be fine. No. You have to understand that some players forget the basic function of the mission is that any player in the game can attempt the mission as long as their affiliation is either A, shown on the card, or B, if it's an open-ended mission that anybody can attempt, then it's fair game. So as long as they have the attributes in their away team or on their crew, it's open season. I don't recommend stacking a deck with a lot of tactic cards. As fun as it is to increase the battle aspect, it also slows the game down. I do have one deck made up with a Battle Bridge side deck that has a lot of tactic cards that I use because it's that kind of a deck. That's the only deck that I use tactic cards in because they have failed me in the past. So, and no, it's not my Borg deck because that Borg deck doesn't need anything extra. And I'll get into that on another show. But another thing I want to discuss today about strategy is the fact that there are several types of players out there in the game. You have Type A, which are just intent on completing the missions and getting the points and not worrying about anything else. Type B, which are attempting missions but also using the battle aspect to further their agendas. And Type C, where they're only there to attempt battle and stop their opponent from making points, and then they'll go off on their merry way and maybe make some points or wipe out their opponent to the point where the game is over. Now, going back to my Borg deck, my Borg deck is set up for Type C. But again, that's the only deck I have set up in that manner, whereas it's such a powerful deck, it's only meant to eliminate the opponent to win the game. But that's not a smart thing to do if you have multiple decks that you're constructing or already have made up. You definitely don't want to fall into Type A or Type C. Type B is the way to go. You want to attempt and complete missions, but you also want to be ready for battle. And from experience, I can tell you, if you're Type A, where you're just going after points, you're leaving about 60% of the game off to the side and everything that it contains. Your opponent can do very bad things to you, especially if you're just hell-bent on going after those missions and trying to clear those dilemmas. You're a sitting duck, basically. And that was the way I played when I first played the game, and when it had its limited amount of affiliations and missions. I thought, oh, well, there's only the 3 affiliations and the 1 non-aligned. I can just go after missions and I don't have to worry. As the expansions started coming out, introducing better cards and newer card types, it became pointless to try to just complete missions and escape by the skin of your teeth. That being said, you also can't be type C and just focus completely on battle. The exception being my Borg deck, which I've already mentioned because that's set up for that purpose. But if you're not playing as the Borg, trying to set up a deck with any other affiliation just to destroy shit is not going to work for you. And I've played against opponents that have done that and they've actually lost. Because they instead of doing anything, and these are the same opponents that not only are they not attempting missions, but they're hardly playing any cards from their hand. All they're doing is stacking up personnel on their ships and a couple enhancements and getting ready to go. What are you doing other than letting your opponent get strong enough to come down there and whoop you? Because that's what will happen. I've had that happen in a game where I've actually played a lesser powered Klingon deck, and my opponent, who I'm not going to name, literally just sat there and just kept dropping personnel down on his ships, completely oblivious to completing missions or anything else like that. When I did encounter him at a joint mission, I guess he wrote me off because I had 2 birds of prey and a Vorcha class cruiser, which wasn't at that location. But because of the cards I still had in my hand and in my draw deck and my 2 ships that were cloaked, boy, was he ever shocked. Not only did I inflict some damage with my birds of prey, but I had enough power cards in my hand to make his life a living hell for the rest of the game. And it ended with me destroying everything at that space-time location with this anti-time anomaly. So everything, and he didn't have anything to counter with because he was too busy heavy loaded with his draw deck with personnel and ships. It worked out. Type B is the way to go. I'm going to keep saying that over and over until a lot of new players get it, because I don't want them to fall into the same trap I did and just build crappy decks off the start. Now, I know I've had a lot of time to develop my strategies because I've been playing it for so long, but at the same time, a lot of my strategies came through losing, because that's the only time you really learn and change is when you lose. And at the time, 1 or 2 of my, what I thought were awesome decks, and they got whooped very quickly, and that gave me pause, and it made me think strategy. And this was when card game magazines like Scry and Inquest and all those were still out there, because we didn't really have the internet yet. So I'd be hounding over these magazines for strategy tips from some of the pros. So it's something you got to keep doing. You got to keep mixing it up and not falling into just one category of player and being one-dimensional, because that's when you will lose and your opponents will stomp you. Anyways, I've pretty much rambled on about strategy long enough today. I might have an upcoming episode at some point where I talk about card types and what card you should have in your deck when you're playing with what affiliation. If you stay tuned to the basics, which is again my mini-series, I'm going to have an episode very soon on weak affiliations, so you do not use them in gameplay. But that's all for Jason's Game Room for today. I hope everybody has a great day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and most importantly, game on, baby.